All right, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Isabel McLean. I'm the Director of Policy and Advocacy at the Virginia Housing Alliance. For those who don't know me, welcome to our virtual State Advocacy 101 training. Today, this is the second training in our webinar series for member organizations throughout Virginia, those who are members of Virginia Housing Alliance, to help prepare them for the 2026 General Assembly, and specifically to participate in our Housing Advocacy Day, which will be February 11th this year. And registration is open for that already. At the end, I'll share a link to that page if you have not already registered. I highly encourage you to do so. We have a lot of information to go through today, so I want to go ahead and get started, although it looks like people are still trickling in. You may have noticed this when you joined, it gave you the notification, but this webinar will be recorded, and the recording and the slides will be shared with everyone who registered for this event today, as well as anyone who registers for our Housing Advocacy Day. So you can share this with any of your coworkers or anyone you know who wasn't able to make it to this training today, and you can review it before the actual advocacy day if you want a refresher on what it means to advocate, how to prepare to talk to legislators, etc. We call it State Advocacy 101, but I will go into a little bit more detail. I think it's maybe a 101, 102. So if you're familiar at least a little bit with advocacy, there might be still some new things that you learned today. But we have designed this to really be an introductory overview for folks who want to advocate but maybe don't have as much experience or want to know a little bit more about how our state General Assembly works in particular, how bills are made here in Richmond, and how to engage in that process. All right, so I do have a lot of information to go over today. I will try to have some time at the end for questions. But in the meantime, if you could introduce yourself in the chat so I know who all is here, what brings you here today, and if you do have any questions that you'd like to have addressed, or anything that isn't quite clear to you that I go over today, go ahead and put that in the chat and I'll make time at the end to check it and answer any of those questions. This is our general overview of what I'll be talking about today. Like I said, it's a lot of information. I'll go over generally what advocacy means and how that compares to lobbying. So I know that I get a lot of questions, especially from folks that work at nonprofits, for what it means to engage in advocacy, what they're kind of allowed to do, how that works. So I'll dive into that and specifically apply it to nonprofits. Then I'll go over tips and general expectations for how to meet with legislators, what that looks like, how to prepare. And then I'll go over how our General Assembly is set up, how it works, and then dive into a little bit about the process for how a bill becomes a law in Virginia. I'll wrap up with general updates about materials from the Virginia Housing Alliance, ways that we can support you, and ways you can stay engaged and up to date on things as they develop. All right. So before I dive in, I am curious if you all already kind of have an understanding about what the difference between just general advocacy and lobbying is. And if you have any thoughts, you can put it in the chat or jump yourself off mute and share anything. In your opinion, what is that difference? I don't want this just to be me talking at you this whole time. It'll be a lot of me talking at you, but would love to hear from anyone if you have an idea. If you don't have an idea, that's okay too. Well, maybe we have a shy bunch that this afternoon, and that's okay. Um, no worries at all. Okay, here someone said, is lobbying getting something in return, monetary wise, pay to play, advocacies for all? In some way, you're kind of getting at it a little bit. So, you've got a piece of it, and I appreciate you jumping in with your thoughts. So I guess to give you an answer to this based on kind of IRS code, which I do want to give a quick disclaimer while I'm talking about this and can generally explain the difference between lobbying and advocacy. I am not giving you legal advice about what you can do necessarily. Don't construe this as legal advice, but just interpreting what we know. So lobbying is defined by the IRS as an attempt to specifically influence legislation. So I guess kind of what Mira was saying about getting something in return is that you are making a specific ask. You're wanting to get something in return specific to a piece of legislation, whether that's a bill or a budget item, like a request that you're specifically making for a program in a budget, etc. And this is something you can do at the local, state, or federal level. There's also an aspect of lobbying called grassroots lobbying, which is when you are asking the public, the general public, to then take an action where they're asking a legislator for a specific piece of legislation. So that is, whereas advocacy, on the other hand, is much broader. It is focused more on education about a specific issue or on behalf of people that you serve. It could be more broadly educating about the need for housing, etc. But as long as you are not making a very specific ask, that is not considered lobbying and is just in general is advocacy. Another way to look at it is that lobbying asks for legislative action, whereas advocacy, your main ask is for attention, and you're trying to spread information. And that information, I mean, it could be very clear that, you're talking about how important the need is and how much we need more funding. And the logical, next step would be for that legislator to increase funding for certain programs that could address that. But advocacy could just be more generally talking about that need and not necessarily making that specific ask. So I'll give some more examples to kind of drive this home. So examples of lobbying are meeting with or writing to legislators asking them to support a specific increase in funding or a specific bill. You can also call and talk to their staff or write a letter to, a chair of a committee, etc., in support of a specific piece of legislation. And then also to capture that grassroots lobbying piece, sending out a call to action to the members of the public, like how VHA does regularly, where we send out calls to action, urging our partners to write to their legislators in support of a funding increase or a specific bill, etc. That is also considered lobbying. And then advocacy, I give a lot of examples here because I think these are a lot of things that people get nervous to do because they're worried that would be considered lobbying. So, for example, distributing fact sheets to legislators about the success of a government-funded program or the ways in which that program is limited by inadequate funding. Disseminating analysis of a piece of legislation. If you have some sort of your own sort of analysis or understanding of something, even if you're not making a specific ask about it, that can be made public. You can always invite legislators to site visits or to tour your property or facility or whatever. Anything related to just general relationship building and education is just considered advocacy, not lobbying. And then it's also important to note that if a legislator reaches out to you to ask for your input on a specific piece of legislation, or they ask you to testify or something, if they're making that request, then that would not be considered your own lobbying, but you're just responding to them. So that's considered advocacy. So it's really important that you are building that sort of relationship, even if you are not dabbling in lobbying and making specific legislative asks, because if you have those relationships, then you can potentially speak on legislation if the legislator asks you to. So I hope that makes sense, the difference between them. And again, if you guys have questions, feel free to put in the chat and we can come back. Now, you might be wondering, why is it important that we have this differentiation? And that is because there are more limitations to lobbying, specifically for nonprofits, et cetera, that that dictate kind of like how nonprofits can engage in political and civic engagement, et cetera. So there are limitations to lobbying. However, it's important to note that there are absolutely no limitations at all to advocacy. So nonprofits can, without any sort of limitation, do those education pieces, that relationship building, the just sharing information and data, and speaking about the need or reporting back on how a program is working that they're administering, etc. There's absolutely no limit to that, but there is a limit to lobbying. And I know that depending on kind of the internal policy of a nonprofit, or for example, like a local agency or et cetera, kind of government or nonprofit agencies, there can be some limitations and internal policies about how to engage in lobbying that have limitations. But I want to say again, there's no limits to advocacy. So technically, the IRS says that lobbying is allowed in some form for nonprofits, but only as long as it's not a substantial part of your organization's activities or time. So while I've been really emphasizing that there's absolutely no limits to advocacy, I also want to make it clear that nonprofits can lobby. I think there's a misconception that absolutely that there's no lobbying allowed. And I will say that some internal policies of nonprofits do kind of communicate that's a decision that they have made. But according to the IRS, lobbying is allowed in some form as long as it's not a substantial part. Now, the IRS doesn't really define substantial super clearly, but it's commonly recommended. Again, don't take this as legal advice, but just based on what we've seen as the norm, that about 5% of your activities, limiting it to about that much would mean that it's not a substantial part of your organization's activities or time. There's also another option if you want to engage in lobbying and want to have a more clear way to ensure that you're staying within these legal guidelines. There's a process where you elect to file your taxes under the IRS 501H law. And this would calculate lobbying limits based on expenditures. So how much of your budget goes towards lobbying activities. And VHA does this because we are technically a nonprofit that engages in lobbying. And so this is a way for us to ensure that we are staying within those limits. So as long as we don't spend more than 20% of our budget on lobbying, we're staying within those limitations. I will also point that nonprofits are not allowed to do any sort of campaigning for electoral candidates. That's where there's a hard limit. You can't participate in any sort of fundraisers or endorse or, specifically advocate in support of a candidate for public office, but that doesn't exclude voter engagement activities, helping folks that you all work with know their rights and know how to exercise their voting rights, and help get them to the polls, etc. In general. The last thing I will note here is that it is general practice not to use funds that you receive from the federal government for certain programs to cover lobbying expenditures. So, even if you're within the substantial limit or, not spending more than 20% of your budget on lobbying, it's generally discouraged to use any sort of funds like HUD funding that you receive to cover any expenses for lobbying activities. And I will say that there are often agreements that folks have to sign when they get funding from the federal government or things like that, that, say don't use this funding for lobbying. But it doesn't mean that you can't lobby using other funding. And again, the final thing I'll say is that there's absolutely no limits to lobbying as an individual and not on behalf of your organization. So I always communicate this too because there are some folks who work for a nonprofit whose internal policies maybe say that, not really encouraging much lobbying, really just only advocacy. And of course, that's unlimited. You can engage in as much advocacy as your nonprofit chooses to. But if there's something that is specifically lobbying, like writing to your legislator about a specific bill, you can always do that as yourself, as an individual, and not on behalf of your organization. And you can always say, this is me, I'm your constituent, and I work at for example, a homeless services provider, but not name it or say that you're speaking on behalf of yourself and not this organization, but you can still speak to what your experience is and expertise is and where you're speaking from to establish that, but still just speak as your individual. So there's always options and always ways to engage, even if it is just as an individual and not as your organization. All right. So now that we've established that, and I hope that we've kind of clarified any sort of nerves or concerns that may prevent people from just even engaging a little bit in advocacy, I think that's sometimes half of the battle is me helping people see that, yes, you see through the uncertainty and a path for how they can engage. Um, so that's really important. But now moving on to what it actually means to meet with legislators and what that can be like and how we can help prepare you for that. So, in general, I think this some of these things may seem like pretty common sense, but it's helpful to lay it out for folks so that they can kind of have a checklist in their head of ways that they can prepare. So the first kind of, like I said, this may be a little bit obvious, but do your research ahead of time. Get to know that legislator who you're reaching out to before you talk to them. Familiarize yourself with their basic information, like at the very least, what district or region they represent. I will say most often you're probably meeting with the legislator that represents where you live, because as a constituent, that's where you have the most power. I mean, technically, that the legislator is working for you. And so you have a lot more power and a lot more say and access to legislators who are specifically representing you. But it doesn't mean that you can only meet with legislators who represent you. There may be reasons why, for example, if a legislator is on a committee that is hearing your bill that you're advocating for, even if you're not living in that person's district, they're going to make decisions about that piece of legislation. And so you may want to talk to them about it. And so just in general, it's important to go in ahead of time knowing who they are, where they represent, what sort of committees they're a part of. Especially, it's good to know if they're on a committee that would be hearing this bill, and if you're using their time wisely, tailoring whatever you're asking to something that would actually come across their desk that they can take action on. You could also be asking them about something that they'll eventually vote on the floor, because every legislator has to vote on something in order for it to pass. But just in general, good to know the background, what you're asking, how what you're asking relates to them. If there's anything about their educational or career background or life experiences that you could connect to. For example, if a legislator has experience working in housing, or if they actually own housing, there are many legislators who are landlords or housing providers. That's interesting to know. Or if they've, worked on issues like this, or are passionate about it, if there's other things that they're working on kind of related to this. And of course, it's important to know what their, if you can, what their party affiliation is, etc., just so that you can tailor your message as much as possible to what you think they would hear. And of course, I touch on this a little bit, but if you are a legislator's constituent, always mention that. Because again, that gives you greater access and greater power. They've got to listen to you because they technically work for you. And then, of course, we always encourage people to take the time ahead of time to prepare your message. While sometimes you might find yourself accidentally in an elevator with a legislator and you just got to give your actual literal elevator pitch on something, and that's the only way that you can get in front of them. As much as possible, try to prepare. You want to make sure that you're coming in with a tone that you prefer, as much as possible. You have the power to sort of set what sort of message you're bringing, even if the legislator responds and changes the tone and has their own sort of response or view on this. You're starting this meeting, and so you have that power to set it how you choose. We always really encourage people that while data is really, really critical, and oftentimes legislators will ask for that and say, well, could you tell me the numbers for specifically like what, to give me a bigger picture of what you're talking about or what the issue is. Stories themselves are the most powerful for changing minds and mobilizing action. And so, especially leveraging your own expertise and your own lived experience is really important there. I always tell folks, who may feel a little bit nervous before meeting with a legislator, because again, this is someone that has a lot of power, who's made a lot of decisions, who may seem like they are just, on a different level. And I understand all the nerves that come with meeting with them. But I always tell people they are people just like you. They, put their pants on in the morning just like everyone else. And in actuality, they should be nervous to talk to you or looking to you for the answers, because you are an expert in your own experience and whatever you're speaking to them about. Some legislators are experts in housing or something, and they might have some of this knowledge, but most of them cannot be experts in everything. And they do not have that sort of knowledge that you do working on the ground, and seeing the issues, uh, you know, uh, as they're happening on the ground. And so I always tell people, if it helps reduce your nerves, just remember you're the expert. You're the one that is going to be educating this legislator and helping them see, help them see the facts about an issue. It's always helpful to bring resources to leave behind, whenever you're meeting with them, like a fact sheet or maybe an overview of your organization, etc. Oftentimes, when you're meeting with legislators, it'll be with staff, or staff will be there too, and they'll be taking notes when you meet. I mean, they have many meetings every day. They're talking to people all the time. And I know that if I didn't take notes, I would forget everything that anyone ever told me. And so they're always taking notes, and it's helpful to have something that they can take notes on, or that already has some of the highlighted points on it, so that when they refer back and say, well, remember we met with this person yesterday, what did they tell us? That you have all of that, all of those asks, all of that materials right there. In front of you, and so for them, so it helps them with clear notes, but that what notes they're actually taking, because you don't know for sure what parts they'll think is important to write down. But if you're giving them the leave behind resource, you've already highlighted what's important for them to remember. And it's really important that they have your contact information, so that you can continue building this relationship. They can reach out to you if they have questions, etc. So I always tell folks to try to bring something to leave behind, or if you're meeting with someone virtual, you can follow up over email and share those resources, or share those resources before you meet. But it's always really helpful as a way to ensure they don't forget about meeting with you. They can remember what you all talked about, what was the most important, etc., and that they can contact you, and kind of remember who you are and who your organization is. And that kind of leads me to this next step, that the goal always should be to try to build relationships. In this work, your relationships is your power. The sort of trust that you're able to build, to have a reputation as an expert, as someone that this legislator would reach out to on issues that you're knowledgeable of, to get your opinion on certain things, or to work with you on building out legislation, etc. That is really, really important, and having that access can lead to so much change. And so that's always my goal and my role very much. And I always joke with people that, relationship building and talking to people is like 80% of my job, that it's all this people work. And that's really where our power is. So it doesn't mean that you're going to be able to have close relationships with every single legislator, or that you should force that to happen. It's obviously, relationships are two-sided. But if you come into these meetings really with this strategy in mind, and have these continual contact points, that's really important. So I always encourage people to follow up after meetings, with a thank you, or like I said, to share resources, etc., to continue to update them on changes, or share new data as it becomes available, etc., etc. And then just in general, a couple last minute things just to keep in mind. If you forget, you can, as you're getting ready for a meeting, you're nervous, it might be helpful to remember just A, B, C, D. So it's really important that you're accurate. Even if you don't know the answer to something, it's way better to say, I don't know, let me follow up with you, than to guess and be wrong. Because again, that's part of building relationships. You want them to trust you as an expert, and to have that accuracy on whatever you're speaking on. You want to be brief. They have very little time, legislators do, and oftentimes it's a game of hurry up and wait. Squeeze in a 10-minute meeting here and there, etc. And so you want to be mindful of that, that you're able to get your message across in a short amount of time if that is all that's given to you. And you want to be respectful of their time too. You don't want to be late or talk for way longer than we're planning, and they're trying to get out of the meeting and then going to be late to something else. That leaves a bad taste in their mouth for meeting with you. So that's kind of a way of being considerate as well. And then, of course, the D is developing relationships. Whatever you're doing, that's really an important goal there. And then just in general for kind of like do's and don'ts, I always tell folks to try to highlight concrete solutions. In general, there are things where, you can talk about the issue and that there's just so many problems. And that's, sometimes that's the reality of some of the conversations you'll have with legislators. But I will say that a way that sometimes it could be overwhelming, and I think this is just the normal human experience, if someone comes to you with a lot of problems and then you are left with, well, what do I do about that? That if you were able to do that work for the legislator and already show them a path to a solution, or you can offer to help work with them to find that, have things that they can say yes to, like that, whether it's like a step one of something that is much bigger. But finding some concrete solutions, that is more motivating and mobilizing for them than to get stuck with just this overwhelming problem. Not that you have to do all of their work for them. They are there to also figure out what these solutions are. But just in general, when you can, that's a helpful way to mobilize. And again, trying to use inclusive language or kind of with an empowering tone in the sense that, again, the best way to kind of mobilize them to get them to do something for you is to make it seem like that's possible and that something that they could do would be actually effective. Again, this doesn't mean for every single message or every single situation. Sometimes it's tough and it would feel really disgenuine to be overly optimistic about something. But I think just in general, human nature is if we come to it with a tone of, this is a serious problem, but there are some concrete solutions that you can do and you can be a part of it to make a difference, that is more likely to spark action as well. And then some kind of don'ts is I always tell folks that yes, you might realize, oh my goodness, I've been working really hard to meet with this legislator. I only have 5-10 minutes, but I have so many things I need to talk to them about, that if you talk about so many different things, it can be hard for them to even remember or focus on anything. And really try to keep your issues really focused on what you really need to talk about. So don't bring up unrelated issues or vague solutions. These legislators are not here to be your friends. That's not what I mean by relationship building. Although sometimes that happens and that's not a bad thing. But you're not here to become friends with them. You're here to create change. And so be really focused on that and what your goals are. And then, of course, I always encourage people, try to be careful about industry jargon. These folks might not know all the acronyms that you do, and they might not understand the programs that you talk about. So always try to keep that in mind. And then, as much as possible, try not to assign blame or make threats. There's a difference between holding a legislator accountable for a vote that they made and the fact that they, have been, maybe actively contributing to a problem or whatever. You want to be careful with how you do that and how you hold someone accountable, and that's not something that's just thrown out as blame, without careful intention and strategy. All right, lastly, a lot of people just ask me like, well, what should I even expect? Like, I don't even know what this will look like. Sure that there's these general messaging strategies, but what does this actually look like? And I always tell people that it's very likely that you will meet with actual staffers instead, and that most of your communication, if you email a legislator, it's their staff that's going to be responding to that. It's their staff that's going to schedule that meeting, and oftentimes it's that staff who's going to actually be at that meeting. Especially for federal legislators, they have so little time that it is pretty rare to actually meet with the legislator themselves down in DC. Again, of course, for like relationship building, or if you're inviting them to a site visit or something like that, you'd want the legislator themselves to be there, of course. But sometimes, if you're in DC for a Hill Day or you're trying to follow up about a specific issue when a bill comes up, that legislator might not have time to meet with you, but you would be more likely to meet with their staff. And that does not mean that they're disregarding your message or that that means that your message is not going to get to the legislator. In fact, relationships with staffers are almost more important than with the legislator themselves because they're the ones that are on the ground meeting with people, that are taking the message that they're hearing from you and summarizing it and sharing with the legislator with their own sort of recommendations based on what they've experienced with you. And so if you get a staffer on your side, it doesn't necessarily guarantee that the legislator will also agree with that staffer, but it could make a huge difference because what will happen next is that staffer will then communicate that to the legislator and make your case. And so it's still really, really important. And we absolutely need to treat staffers with respect because, again, a lot of the work happens, they're in charge of a lot of the work. Legislators do not absolutely act alone. It's impossible for them to do so. And so the staffers are just as busy and just as important. Um, Yeah, and then again, just kind of on here is that it could be that it's a very quick meeting. It could be that you're even meeting with a legislator in a hallway outside of a meeting room because there's too many people already in the office, etc. Um, Again, I wouldn't always read that as a disregard, of you and your time, but just sometimes that's the reality is they have a lot of demands on their time. Have a lot of things that committee hearings that'll get scheduled that they suddenly have to be at. It's really hard to plan ahead with in the world of legislative making. And so always, be willing to be flexible and try to kind of meet them when you can. And then, of course, be considerate with the time that you do get. If you're also trying to kind of have a picture in your mind for how these meetings will look, we have these general tips for meeting flow that can be helpful. Obviously, of course, all the preparation work. And then when you get there, making sure that you're introducing yourself and everyone there that's meeting with the legislator with you, explaining kind of your perspective and what kind of brings you here, what sort of expertise you bring to the table. Definitely if you're a constituent, etc. And then it's important if it's in person, especially that you distribute materials ahead of time so that, like I said, they could be taking notes on that material as you're speaking, or they can follow along and helps them pay attention a little bit more. Sometimes I've done that before and it looks like the staffer's just reading the paper and not listening to me. Sometimes there's a risk that that could happen, but I think that in general, it's good to give it ahead of time so they can follow along. And then after you share your own message, if you do have time, I think it's important to ask the legislator, for their own sort of feedback or response, or if they are working on any, priorities that are similar, or if there's any opportunities for you to work with them or support the work that they're doing. So that it doesn't always just seem like you're here telling them what to do, but that you're also there, for that relationship building to work with them on other solutions that they might be working on too that could be, important as well. And then, of course, before you leave, make sure you thank them for their time, and then make sure that they have a way to contact you afterwards. It's really important. Alrighty, whew. Deep breath. Cool. We're making good time. We've got through a lot of information here. I know that this is a lot. Just a reminder again that this is recorded. The slides will be shared afterwards. We have other resources too related to this as well. So if there's something that you're missing as I'm sharing a lot of information, there are ways to kind of follow back up and check back into this. All right, so moving on to how the Virginia General Assembly works and what that looks like. So the General Assembly is what we use to, that's how we refer to our state legislators that make laws at the state level here in Virginia at the Capitol in Richmond. And that is composed of two chambers, the Senate and the House of Delegates. In the Senate, there are 40 members who represent different Senate districts across the state. And in the House of Delegates, there are 100 members who represent different House districts across the state. Senators serve a term of 4 years, where delegates serve a term of 2 years. And if you'll, remember the election that just happened in November, we were electing our House representatives, our House delegates, as well as also the state leadership, like the governor, lieutenant governor, and attorney general. But the senators were not up for election. So this was in the within the 2-year term that delegates are up for election again, but our senators are still in the middle of their 4-year term, and they won't be up for election for another 2 years. So it's kind of alternates for how many folks that you are voting for when you go to the polls in November. Um, Now, within the House and the Senate, there are a lot of different roles that legislators play. There are specific leadership positions in each chamber and also in each political party. These leaders then appoint membership and chairs and other leadership positions in each standing committee. And committees are created and determined based on topic issue because, whatever sort of bills come through, there has to be some sort of organized way to deal with each of these bills. And usually legislators might have more knowledge about a certain topic, and so they would get assigned to a committee that looks at bills of that certain topic. Um, but I say it's really important to know who is in leadership positions, who is in a leadership position of the whole chamber, president of the Senate or speaker of the House, or who is in leadership positions of each party, who is the chair of the Democratic caucus, chair of the Republican caucus, etc. And then also what committees legislators are a part of, who is the chair of those committees, etc., because they do carry varying levels of power. And so it's important to know, also who you should even be talking to, where your bill is going to go to, what committee, who's going to be making decisions about those things, etc. You can see who all of our legislators are on, there's a really great website called virginiageneralassembly.gov. There's also, and I'll talk about this later, there's a website called LIS that also has all of our legislators and their committees that they're a part of, etc. If you don't know who your own legislator is, who's representing you, there's a very easy tool on the virginiageneralassembly.gov website that's where you can just type in your address um, and it'll tell you it's who's my.virginia@generalassembly.gov. And for some reason, I can't copy this link and put it in the chat, but I will make sure that this link is embedded in the slides when we send it with you. You can also just Google who is my legislator, Virginia General Assembly, and this will come up. And then in order to understand, I mentioned that it's on the General Assembly website, it's also on the LIS website, but there's also a very helpful app that I use all the time when the legislative session actually begins, so I know where to go and where people's offices are especially, but just in general, there's an app called VPAP General Assembly that if you go to it, you can see all of the legislators. You can see them by the House, by the Senate, and as you see in this image here, for example, Benita Anthony shows she's a Democrat. D shows which room is her office and which House district she represents. If you click on their names, I'll also show you which committees they're a part of, etc. And so it's just a really good guide for, committees, kind of who makes up the House and the Senate, what sort of leadership roles they have, et cetera, is all listed here. And like I said, I use this a lot because I'm constantly visiting different offices and I never remember where they are. So I'm always checking this app and making sure that I'm headed in the right direction. Um, so give you a little bit more information about the General Assembly. So where is it? The actual building where most of the all of the legislators' offices are, where there's most of the rooms where committees meet, where they discuss and debate bills, is at the General Assembly building, which is located at 201 North 9th Street in Richmond. It's right next to the Virginia State Capitol. The Virginia State Capitol building is where the House and the Senate meet for their floor sessions. So when the whole chambers meet together and they vote on the bills that have passed out of committee, etc., that's where they meet for that sort of floor session. There's also some rooms there for committee meetings, but most of them do still happen in the General Assembly building. Most of the offices in the General Assembly building are between the fourth and 14th floor. It's a pretty tall building. Um, and there, sometimes there's a lot of traffic at the elevators because of that. Um, there's a visitor entrance on Broad Street where you'd have to go through a metal detector, just a brief kind of security entrance. But I always tell people that too, just so you know, like don't accidentally bring a pocket knife with you if you're going to the General Assembly building, or be prepared that you will have to go through a metal detector. You could still bring your computer and other things, your phone or whatever, in a bag that'll go through, kind of an X-ray machine. But just keep in mind that there is some security, but it is open to the public during the legislative session and during normal hours too throughout the year. There's also a cafeteria on the first floor too and a little coffee shop. So there's places that you can hang out and get food as well throughout the day. In Virginia, our technical General Assembly, or the actual time when legislators all come together and vote and decide on bills, introduce bills, etc., is it starts every year on the second Wednesday of January. And I will say, Virginia, compared to other states, has an incredibly short legislative session. I did not grow up here, and when I moved here and first learned how quick these sessions go, I was astonished because this is definitely on the shorter end, and it can feel very stressful to have all this work piled into just a few, in short sessions, 30 to 45 days, and in longer sessions, 60 days. Um, that is a very short amount of time. But now I'm used to it, and now I am like, wow, 30 days, let's hurry up and get this over with. I'm tired. But anyway, this is the reality in Virginia. And the reason why they're not just the same every year is because Virginia passes our budget on a biennium cycle. So when we pass a budget, it's technically for 2 years. The next year, we can come back and make changes to the second year of that budget. But most of those decisions are made in even number years, so that would be the longer session, so there's more time to pass that budget. This year, the one we're looking towards in 2026 is an even year, so it is a longer session, 60 years, and they are going to, 60 days, whoops, 60 days, and they're going to be working on the budget for fiscal year 27 and 28. And then the next year will be a shorter year because they'll only be really able to make, changes to the budget that's already been passed. And that usually is about 45 days. Alrighty. So I'll try to get through this a little bit quickly. I don't need to go into as much detail as like Schoolhouse Rock with, I'm just a bill sitting on Capitol Hill. But I do want to just give a brief kind of overview about how a bill becomes a law, because it's important to know, where your bill is in this process and when it's strategic to meet with legislators about it. Virginia Housing Alliance, we have a legislative bill tracker that we make publicly available to everyone during the session. We're working on that right now. It's not quite yet available, but there's also not a ton of bills introduced yet, but that should be available on our website very soon. And that's the easiest way to kind of track a bill's progress, and it'll show you kind of where it is, when it gets assigned to a committee, etc. But if you want to just know more broadly outside of that, there's kind of a general process. And again, I mentioned that I'll share the slides to this. We also have some other resources. We have a one-pager that also shows this more detailed process for how a bill becomes law. We have a Advocacy 101 toolkit that also includes that information, etc., that we will share with you all in addition to the slides, so you can refer back to it, since I'm not going to go into a ton of detail. But in general, a bill is born when a legislator introduces it. It gets proposed to kind of the staff that support the General Assembly. It's called the Division of Legislative Services. They're the ones that actually draft bills and monitor them and support committees and do all of that sort of legal support work that's necessary. So they would actually draft it and then publish it on the LIS website, publish it so that all legislators have access to it, and it's officially introduced. Now, if the legislators in the House or the Senate, that depends on where it starts. So it would start in that initial chamber, wherever they belong, and it would get referred to the relevant committee. So the chairs of each committee kind of decide which bills should go to each of theirs based on the topic. And then it's discussed and voted on by that committee itself. So most of where the important decisions on a bill, like if there's going to be amendments to it, or if it really is, got enough support to move on, that really important decisions and evaluation, more detailed evaluation, happen in the committee. Again, while every bill does have to get voted on by every legislator in order to pass, usually when it makes it out of committee, there can still be debate, there still can be changes, there's still, stuff like that can happen, absolutely. But most of the time that happens in committee. And so it's really important that that's where most of the engagement is, to ensure that that's where the most detailed dive into that bill happens. If it passes out of committee, it goes and considered by that whole chamber. It's read on the floor when that whole chamber meets. It technically has to be, it follows the process of being read, where it's like kind of announced on the chamber floor that it made it out of committee, then it's read through and explained, and then it's voted on. If it passes out of that full chamber, then it crosses over to the other chamber. There is actually a date called crossover and the kind of a midpoint at session where it's kind of a deadline where all bills in each chamber of origin must have already passed and then crossed over to the other chamber in order to be considered, because there still needs to be enough time for the other chamber to actually consider it. If a bill doesn't cross over until 2 days before session is over, that really doesn't give the other chamber nearly enough time to actually consider it and then vote it itself. So there is a specific deadline where bills have to cross over by, and then they're considered by the other chamber. Now, in the other chamber, they're again sent to a relevant committee and debated upon. Amendments can still be made and happen, and if they are, and then it eventually is voted on by that full chamber as well. If that happens and the bills versions that are passed out of each chamber are a little bit different, they would appoint what's called a committee of conference, where there's a certain number of legislators. Usually it's the legislator that introduced the legislation and maybe some other folks that are experts on that committee on that specific issue, topic, etc., that come together and work out the different versions of the bill and decide on kind of what bill version they can both agree on. And then that bill has to then pass, be passable by both chambers. Once that has happened, then the bill is sent, all bills are sent to the governor. The governor can either sign a bill into law, the governor can amend the bill and return it to the legislator for approval, or the governor can veto a bill. The governor can also just let the bill pass without their signature. That's also an option if they, don't want to stop it, but don't really want to necessarily sign it. That is an option too. But specifically for the veto, it's important to know that if they veto it, the only way that the legislature can overturn that is if they have a 2/3 majority vote to do that. So the governor does have a lot of power there that does require even more of a majority to overturn that. So that's the general pathway for bills. I've mentioned this website a couple times now, but this is LIS, the Legislative Information System website. This is where all the information about the bills that you may be interested can be found. Again, we have our legislative tracker that can show you those things as well. And then if you follow our tracker, there's links to their actual LIS page where you can see more details, the actual bill language, etc. But you can explore this website yourself. You can see all the delegates and senators. You can see the standing committees, daily floor calendars. You can watch videos of hearings. You can submit testimony, etc. here, sign up to give virtual testimony, etc., which I'll talk a little bit more about later. And then the last thing I'll mention, just along the lines of how a bill becomes a law, is that usually when bills are passed in legislative session, there is a little bit of a delay before they're actually enacted and become law. Most often in bills and the budget that's passed during regular session, those are become effective July 1st. That's the start of the new fiscal year, but that's also when bills become law. There is also because the governor can, amend bills and send it back to the legislature, there's often what's called a reconvene session where after the session's already adjourned, they've sent bills to the governor. After the governors respond, then the legislature comes back together for a short time to respond to the governor's actions. And that's just a normal part of session, but technically that can happen anytime. The governor can reconvene session and bring legislators back if there's like an emergency to respond to. That happened during COVID. That can happen other times as well. And so they can come back, and if there's a bill that's passed during, then usually that's effective the fourth month after that reconvene session convenes, etc. There's also the option for emergency acts that are effective upon signature, but that's just kind of general how it works. All right, we're almost here at the end, so I want to just wrap up just to kind of bring this home for what we're looking at for next year, or just, a month basically from now. This next legislative session, the 2026 General Assembly, starts on January 14th. And we will have a new governor that is sworn in, I think, the weekend, that Saturday after. I think that's the 17th then. And so this will be an interesting legislative session as we kind of get used to having a new governor as well. This is a long session, as I said before. This will last 60 days, and they are going to be working on the budget as well. I mentioned this before, but we do our legislative tracker, so please keep an eye out for when that is posted on our website. We also have our legislative agenda available, and on Monday we had our webinar where we went over our legislative agenda. That was recorded and will also be shared with you all and anyone going to our advocacy day if you want a deeper dive into what our legislative priorities are. Materials supporting all of those priorities, some are posted on our website, but more will continue to be posted as we get closer to session. Also, we send out weekly email updates to our member organizations and anyone who works for our member organizations on our legislative agenda and kind of where those bills are, what's happening as decisions are made. It's not comprehensive of every single housing related bill, but just related to our agenda. And so there's a lot of ways that you can stay up to date. And if you are worried that you might not be on the list of our members, or you work for a member, but maybe you have a different contact information, etc. I've got a slide here where you can scan that QR code and either sign up or update your contact info for member emails. That's just our general sign up for news and communication, which is where we set up a separate list for things to go to members. And then, of course, we also have our calls to action or our policy alerts that we send out when it's really a strategic time to reach out to your legislators. And we always provide, talking points and kind of a pre-written email with some room for you to add your own messaging too. That'll go directly to your representative, your delegate, and your senator. If you're not already signed up to receive those, I highly encourage you to. We send out several during the legislative session when it's really important that we have as many people as possible communicating to legislators about a certain bill or priority. So highly encourage you all to make sure that you are able to stay in the loop on these updates. Here's a link to our State Policy Initiatives webpage where you can see updates to our legislative agenda when we continue to upload more materials related to these priorities. Some are up right now, but more are still in development right now. So, if you want to find our talking points, our one pager about certain items to then inform what sort of messages you share with legislators, we try to make it as easy as possible for you, and you can directly use that language. It'll be available here. And the last thing I say is I have mentioned this, I think a few times now, that we have several resources to help support you in this. Not only the recording of this webinar and the slides from this webinar, but we have a Advocacy 101 toolkit. We have a guide to how a bill becomes a law in Virginia. And we also have a virtual testimony guide for how it works to submit written testimony or sign up to testify virtually, because every hearing, every meeting that's done at the General Assembly, you can watch it live. And there are options to engage in it virtually too. You can always come in person to a hearing, and there's an opportunity where they ask for testimony from the public and you can stand up and testify in person. and that doesn't require signing up ahead of time. But if you do want to do it virtually, we really encourage a lot of folks to do that. It's, sometimes not always easy to come to Richmond, but there are ways to do that. And so we'll share this one-pager guide on how to do that with folks too. It's a little bit tricky and kind of annoying because there's a different process for the Senate and a different process for the House. But this will be an easy way to ensure that you can watch sessions, you can know which committee will hear your bill, and how you can potentially sign up. Um, Alrighty, well, I finished with 5 minutes at the end here for questions. So let me check the chat, but of course, if any of you all have questions, you can just unmute yourself too and ask. Um, I hope this wasn't too much information, but if anyone has any questions, have at it. All right, it looks like someone asked, if our agency releases an annual impact report, should we have some on hand to distribute since I know our time is usually limited? And the answer is yes, absolutely. Bring any sort of materials that you have that you've worked really hard on that do a great job of summarizing the work you do, or have information about any of that sort of educational materials that could be really important, that can, support any sort of message, whether it's advocacy or lobbying. I think that's a great thing to bring with you, or email to the legislator. If you only have 5 or 10 minutes, you might not be able to go through all of that, but they can then reference that later. And a lot of legislators do just keep a lot of resources that they might not look at immediately, but they have it on hand if a question comes up, and then they can say, well, you know what, we actually have the annual impact report, so we can look at that and find an answer. Does anyone else have any questions? Here, I'll stop sharing my screen. And of course, anyone can totally feel free to reach out to me over email with any other questions. I just put my email there in the chat. If you have anything that comes up later. Oops, come on, internet, there we go. There's also the link to sign up for our Housing Advocacy Day if you're not already registered. We will have one more session in this series right before Advocacy Day that will be a brief overview of everything that we've talked about in this one and on Monday, just kind of reiterating what we're going to be advocating for, but also going over logistics for the day and what it'll look like, what'll be asked for you, how to get ready for it. So if you're coming to our Advocacy Day, highly recommend that you keep an eye out for when that webinar registration is available, and that you can sign up for that too. But again, the recording and all of these materials will be shared with everyone who registers for Advocacy Day. So thank you all so much for coming. I really appreciate it. All the work that we do is nothing without you all. I mean, our power is in the partnerships and relationships and other advocates that we work with. So thank you so much for coming and for advocating with us.
Thank you.
Thanks, Isabel.
Thanks, Isabel. Great job.
Take care.